Hi, in this video, we're going to be doing a walkthrough for the perceptual and preference map example so that we can do brand positioning. And in this case, we have data that comes from 50 respondents who gave us their preferences for shopping at a set of different retailers and their perceptions about these retailers when it comes to a set of attributes. Now, in order to do this, first step is we're going to take the data into R, and we're going to run the principal component analysis in order to create the perceptual map. And we're also going to create a preference map to see where people are positioned. So let's go ahead and start in R. Now, the file that we want to open is in chapter 5. It's called Perceptual and Preference Maps. Now, in this file, go ahead and make it bigger so we can see it. We always start by looking to see if there are any packages we need to install. And in this case, we do need to install a package called data.table. So let's go ahead and install that package. We'll choose the cloud. So once that package is installed, you don't have to do that again. You can, if you open R a future time, all you need to do is run the library command to set up the package in R, and we'll go ahead and run our seed command to set our random number generator. Okay, so next step, we want to bring in the data for the perceptions and the preferences from the survey we ran. So our first file we want to bring in is the perceptions data. So this is in chapter 5, perceptions. And if we want to see the data, what it looks like, we'll go ahead and just type head of the PER data set. And we can see here the different retailers and the average perception scores from the 50 respondents for those retailers. Let's go ahead and bring in the preference file as well. That's the file called preferences.csv. Again, if we want, we can look and see a little bit of the data here by typing head of the preference file. And we can see here the different responses for the different retailers for these first 6 respondents, right? Where a higher number means they have stronger preference to shop, and a lower number means that they have less preference to shop. So what we need to do now is we first run the principal components analysis on the perceptual data. So we see the perceptual data here. We're going to run the principal component analysis. That's this step. Next, we're going to take the results of that analysis to create the different data points that we need to create our map. Our first set of data points we're going to create are the attributes, locations for the perceptions. So in order to do that, we'll run this section. This section will end by us writing out a comma separated file that we're going to call perceptions_attributes. So we'll put that in chapter 5. So perceptions_attributes.csv. Create that file. The next step is we're going to create the brand factors. So we're going to create the scores. In order to do that, we'll run this section and we'll write out a file called perceptions_scores. Scores.csv. And in the third step for the preferences, we'll create preference scores as well. So when we're doing the joint map, we can add the preference scores to the table. So in order to do that, we'll run this section and we'll export a file that we'll name preference_scores. Okay. So now we've created the 3 data sets that we need to build our maps. So we're going to head over to Tableau and start assembling those maps. So here we see Tableau. We're going to first start by opening our first data set. So we'll start with the perceptions attributes data. And we'll see that it loads up nicely. Now, what's interesting about these data sets that we're going to use to create our perceptual map and then our joint perceptual and preference map is that there's no common linkage between the data. Essentially, they're just being mapped onto a two-dimensional surface and overlaid on top of each other. Because of that, we're not going to actually create intersections of the data. We're going to create what are called unions of the data, where we're going to let each group be its own set of data that we can overlap on top of each other. So to create a union of data, we're going to go where we have perceptions attributes. We'll hit the drop-down arrow and choose Convert to Union. And then it'll ask us, what other data sets do you want to add? Right now, we're just going to do the perceptual map. So we're just going to add the perception scores data. So we'll drag that in here into the box and say, OK. And you can see it added that data. And because it's not overlapping, there's missing values here. Whereas down below, you can see for the retailers, there's missing values on the attribute factors. So now we have what we need in order to create our perceptual map to see the retailers and the attribute factors. So let's go ahead and go to sheet 1. Now, the first thing we need to do in sheet 1 is we are going to add the attribute names and the brand names to our map. So to do that, we're just going to drag attributes into the map. Oops, we can drag them first just into text, and that'll put them on the map nicer. Then we'll drag brand to text and put those on the map. Right? So now those are going to be on the map when we start putting our data points there. So the next step is we're going to tell Tableau that the path variable that we're going to use to draw our vectors is not a measure, but in fact, it's a dimension. All right, now we want to start building our map, which means we're going to put our factors and our scores onto the map. So we'll go ahead and drag factor 1 to columns, and we'll match that one with score 1. So we'll drag score 1 up to columns. Then we'll drag factor 2 to rows, and we'll drag score 2 to rows. Now, what you're starting to see is that we're getting this map that's beginning to, at this point, it's not overlaid on top of each other, but we have a map of retailers and we have a map of attributes. In order to overlay the two maps, we're going to create dual axes. So we're just going to go to score 1 and choose dual axis. And you'll see that'll make, at least in this case, one axis overlaps with factor 1 and score 1. We'll go ahead and do the same thing for score 2 and create a dual axis. So now you can start to see we have a map with the retailers and the attributes showing up on a single map. We'll go ahead and make the map a little bigger. So if you click here where it says standard, you can choose entire view, and this will cause the map to build out into the entire view. The next thing we might want to do is synchronize our axes so that they're measuring the same rate. So we'll right click on the axis and choose synchronize axis. We'll click on this axis, choose synchronize axis, and we'll see now the same scales are on the X and Y axis. So now what we want to do is we want to actually draw the vectors from the origin out to these locations of these attributes. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to click on all here so that we can draw the paths. We're going to drag the path over to shape. And then we're going to change it from being automatic to being a line. Now you can see here we've got lines that go to our different attribute locations. Now we also see here that for those that are on the left-hand side, we do not see the names showing up if we want, whereas on the right-hand side we do. So if we want the names to show up, we just start by clicking the first one. Then I'm going to hold down Control and go ahead and click the other ones. Then I can right-click on any one of them and choose mark label always show. Now what you see is the names of the attributes are now showing on the left-hand side to see as well, right? The last thing I can do, I can get rid of this thing, which just tells me that because I have a union of data, there's some missing data points across the two different types of data. If I right click on that, I can hide it so I don't see that. The next thing I can do is I can change the name. In this case, the name of this is the perceptual map of retailers and attributes. Okay, so now what we have is we actually have the perceptual map that we can utilize to better understand how these survey respondents perceive the retailers in terms of these attributes, right? So what we can see, for instance, is for our brand, Chestnut Ridge, our retailer, we seem to be loading fairly highly on the attribute of product variety, a little bit on convenience over here. And if we draw the perpendicular line here, we're about halfway up on in-store experience, right? We also see retailer E actually sits outside of us on the map, which suggests that retailer E dominates us in terms of people's perceptions of product variety, convenience, and in-store experience. So it seems like retailer E is one of our direct competitors that we have to worry about. Right? So let's go ahead now and save this. We'll say save as. And we're going to create this as a Tableau packaged workbook so that the data is included in the workbook. And we're going to call this perceptual mapping. Okay. So now we've got our perceptual map. Next step, we might want to go back and actually create our joint map where we put the preferences on top of the same picture. There's two things we could do. One, we could start with a new map and just go back to scratch and do these same steps up to this point. And then we could add the additional data to do the preferences. What I'm going to do is take the same map. I'm going to go back to our data source. And all I'm going to do is again go and now I'll edit the union. Right? So we have the attributes and the scores. Now we're going to add the preferences. So we drag that in here. So we're going to add the preference scores. When we do that, we can actually see now we have the attributes, we have the retailers, and then down below, we also have the respondents' preference locations for those retailers. Okay. So we go back to sheet 1 now. We'll see here that the same data, the same map is here. Now what we want to do is we actually want to put those preference dots onto the map. So there's a couple of things we need to do in order to do that. One is we want to actually tell Tableau again that respondents are not measures, respondents are people, they're dimensions. So we'll go ahead and make the respondents dimensions. Now what we want to do is we actually want to add those respondents to our map. And the place we want to add them to our map is under score 1, because that's where the score is where our preferences lie. Right? So we're going to add the respondents by dragging it to detail. Now it'll kind of look funny because it's going to assume that you want the same lines that you had for the attributes. We don't. We can go ahead and choose maybe circle. Right? So now we can see these different respondents in these spots. Now, one thing we notice is that these respondents are actually in the same location or same color as our retailers. So if we want to distinguish the colors, we can do that using this preference that we have, because we know the preference will tell us which one are retailers and which ones are respondents. So we'll go ahead and drag preference to color. You can already see that it's changed the color. It's kind of light blue versus dark blue. If we want more divergent colors, we can go over here where it says preference and choose edit colors. We can choose maybe orange blue diverging. And this isn't very orange, so I can click on a color and pick a specific. We'll pick a nice bright orange. Say OK. When we do that, what you see is you actually see now the retailers are orange. The respondents are blue, and you can begin to see where there are large blocks of preference. So there seems to be a lot of preference for stores that have product variety and good in-store experience. There seems to be a little bit of preference here between convenience and product variety. There seems to be a little over here where, again, we need to control click on these because it decided to hide the names. So a little bit of preference over here for location convenience, right? So lastly, because we've created a new map, we're going to go ahead and double click in here, and we're going to change this name to Joint Perceptual and Preference Map of Retailers and Attributes. Right, so now we have the joint map here, and we'll go ahead and save this file over the top. So we'll click Save As instead of Save. And this one we're going to name, instead of perceptual mapping, we can call this one joint mapping. Again, we'll save it as a Tableau package workbook so the data is included. All right, so now what we've seen with this exercise is we have the ability to take that survey data, which includes the attributes and people's perceptions of different retailers on those attributes, right? And that helped us create that perceptual map. Then we can also add the preferences if we want to the map, which will help us understand things like whether or not we want to move on the map, right? We already know as Chestnut Ridge that we're dealing with retailer E, right, who seems to be dominating us on these dimensions. The question is, where would we want to move? Do we just want to move outside of retailer E over here? Or do we want to consider maybe moving over into this space where there's a lot more preference? In which case, we not only need to continue to focus on product variety as an attribute that people perceive us as having, being good at, but maybe also move farther up on the in-store experience attribute so that we can capture some preference here, keeping in mind that if we do that, there's a good chance we'll also be competing a little bit more with retailer D now. All right. So hopefully you've seen now how to do perceptual maps and then add preferences to those perceptual maps to create these joint maps.